Section 12 of National Geographic Magazine, Volume 2, Numbers 1 and 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A critical review of Bering's first expedition 1725–30, together with a translation of his original report upon it, by William H. Dahl, Part 2. Sources of information. The General History of China, done from the French P. du Halde. London, John Watts, 1736, 4 volumes, 8vo, with maps and ills. This is referred to in the following text by the letter B. This is the first English translation from the original French edition of the Description géographique et historique de l'Empire de la Chine, by the Father J. B. du Halde, published at The Hague in the same year as the above translation. The text of the original French I have not been able to consult, though, so far as Bering's voyage is concerned, there does not seem to have been any material abridgment in the translation above cited, for an opportunity of consulting which I am indebted to the Librarian of Congress. The maps and charts of the original French edition were separately printed in an atlas by themselves for the use of those who might desire to do without the text, under the following title: Nouvel Atlas de la Chine, de la Tartarie chinoise et du Tibet, contenant le chart génériel et particulier de ces pays, ainsi que la carte du royaume de Corée, rédigés par M. Danville, géographe ordinaire de Sa Majesté très chrétienne, précédé d'une description de la boucherie, par un officier suédois qui a fait quelques séjours dans ce pays, à La Haye, chez Henri Schiller, 1737, folio, 12 pages, 42 charts. The chart of Bering forms sheet 42 and differs from the others in being on Mercator's projection, which indicates that it was copied directly from an original as stated in the text and not redrawn. It is 20 3/4 by 9 3/8 inches on the neat lines and is entitled Carte des pays traversés par le Captain Berings depuis la ville de Tobolsk jusqu'à Kamchatka. Beneath the title is a table of 4 transliterated Russian terms for fort, post, village, and convent, with their French equivalents. This and certain peculiarities in the transliteration of proper names make it certain that the original chart was in Russian and that the transliteration was done by someone not perfectly familiar with both languages. There are a few errors of the engraver in rendering single letters, C appearing for T and R for E in a few places. The longitude is reckoned in degrees east of Tobolsk, to which 67 degrees, when added, will give practically the meridian east from Greenwich. The transcriber of the map from the Russian appears to have been a Dane, G. Condet. That part of this chart east from 112 degrees east of Greenwich has been fairly reproduced by Lauridsen, with the omission of some unimportant names and the addition of a signature, not the ordinary autograph, of Bering. This is reproduced with a different running headline to accompany Olson's translation. The 4th volume of Brooks' translation, pages 429 to 440, contains, quote, a succinct narrative of Captain Bering's travels into Siberia, end quote, with a reduction of the above-mentioned map, on which there is no trace of the island of St. Demetrius, even its name, which alone appears on the du Halde map, is here omitted. Otherwise, this version of the map does not differ from du Halde's more than one copy of a drawing usually differs from another. When Bering started on his expedition he was accompanied by 2 cartographers, Lutzin and Potilov, and to one or both of them under Bering's direction the construction of the map in question was probably due. When Bering made his report it was accompanied by a list of positions for important places visited by the expedition. Dr. Campbell, while gathering material for his second edition of Harris's Voyages, procured a copy of this unpublished list of positions and prints it in his account of Bering's travels, with the comment that it was sent by Bering from Kamchatka before his return to Russia, and to the Senate at St. Petersburg, to which Bering did not report. Whether due to the transcriber or the printer, there are several very obvious errors in the list as printed by Campbell, and when it is compared with Bering's own list, we see that there are also several interpolations. But the positions adopted in the chart, said by Du Halt to have been brought to St. Petersburg by Bering on his return, a statement confirmed by the mention of a chart in the report itself, are not identical with the positions enumerated in the list. This leads to the suspicion that Bering's first chart was not published, and that the chart issued was due to a recomputation and revision of his data. This suspicion is made stronger by the statement of Lauridsen, who gives no authority, however, that Bering's chart was made in Moscow in 1731, though this may merely mean that some of the copies which were distributed to various personages were so prepared. These manuscript copies of the chart and report were sent to various foreign courts as a matter of general interest by the Russian authorities. The copy used by Du Halt was communicated to him by the King of Poland, who had received it as a present worthy of his regard and curiosity. Other copies were sent to Sweden, and probably to England and other countries. In the journal Ymer of the Swedish Society for Anthropology and Geography, 1884, page 93, is a short notice by E. Dahlgren of 3 manuscript copies of Bering's chart of his first expedition, or rather of charts embodying its results. 2 of these charts are in the Royal Archives of Sweden and measures 58 by 135 centimeters. One of them is ornamented with 10 colored drawings of natives of Siberia. The other is without this, but does not seem to be a copy of the first, as it has a number of soundings between St. Lawrence and the Diomede Islands which are not on the former, and some names which are peculiar to it. Both have many more names than are given on the chart published by Du Halt. Both of the manuscripts have a legend referring to the coast from the Kolyma eastward, on the north coast of Siberia, to the effect that it is put down from other charts and information, doubtless furnished by the archives at Yakutsk. The third copy is in the possession of Baron Robert Klinckofström of Stafsund, Sweden. Through the kind offices of Baron Nordenskjöld and the generosity of Baron Klinckofström, the last mentioned chart has been forwarded to the writer through the Smithsonian Institution for examination. It appears to be essentially the same as the second of the 2 charts referred to as comprised in the Royal Swedish Archives. The result of my examination of it leads me to the belief that there were 2 different charts sent out in manuscript by the Russian authorities. The first, which I regard as the earlier and which is certainly more accurate, shows the island of St. Demetrius in its proper place in accordance with Bering's report and list of positions. It formed the basis of Campbell's engraving, which will be referred to later, and of the chart which appears in the various editions of Du Halt. It is possible that this represents the original chart prepared by Bering in Kamchatka during the winter of 1728-9. The second and probably later form of the chart is represented by the Klinckofström chart, upon which the name and island of St. Demetrius have vanished, and a smaller island in the corresponding latitude is represented close to the Siberian coast and westward from the meridian passing through the eastern extreme of East Cape. This island is named the island of St. Diomede. If it is intended as a revised position for the island of St. Demetrius of the other chart and of Bering's report, it is in conflict with the facts and with the position assigned to St. Demetrius in the report. No one who had sailed between St. Demetrius and East Cape could have sanctioned such a position for the island with honesty. If a different island is intended, the question arises, why is St. Demetrius omitted? This second chart is obviously the basis upon which, in D'Anville's chart of Asia 1758, the configuration of the eastern extreme of Siberia is based, and I suspect that the chart of the Imperial Academy of Sciences at St. Petersburg and the reproduction of Jefferys were also derived from it as far as this region is concerned. It would be rash, in the absence of authentic information which only the Russian archives can supply, to hazard an opinion as to the origin of the important difference between these charts. I may return to this point later. Apart from this, it may be added that the northern coast of Siberia from East Cape west to Cape Shelagskoy is represented as mountainous throughout its extent. A legend states that it is laid down from older charts and information. This relieves Bering from the responsibility for the fictitious, or at least grossly erroneous and exaggerated form and direction given to Cape Shelagskoy on his chart. The west coast of the Okhotsk Sea and part of its northeastern shores, not visited by Bering, are stated to be laid down from "information." This map is not dated, and the blank space in the title left for Bering's autograph has never been filled. No name of draftsman or place or authority of issue are indicated upon it. It measures 51 by 20 1/8 inches between the neat lines. It is in black and white, the mountains washed in, the only color being small green trees as a conventional sign for wooded country. A copy of the earlier chart fell into the hands of Dr. Campbell and was published by him in his edition of Harris's Voyages, together with a version of the report which is more or less mutilated, and to which the editor, to make his book more readable, has added certain flowers of rhetoric which detract from its accuracy. Campbell's copy of the map is the most perfect yet published, and the only one showing the island of St. Demetrius in its proper place. In Du Halde's copy, and those derived from it, the eastern border of the chart has cut off the island, though in some of them, as in that of 1736, the name remains. The only fault to be noted in Campbell's edition of Bering's map is the omission by the engraver of the small bay named Preobrazhenia by Bering, and which, though it is not named, appears on the other editions of the map. The title is as follows: "An exact chart of all the countries through which Captain Bering travelled from Tobolsky, capital of Siberia, to the country of Kamchatka." The size of the map is 7 by 12¾ inches. It extends on the east to the meridian of 126° east from Tobolsk, which enables the Isle of St. Demetrius, our present Big Diomede, to appear in its proper place. The editions previously reported have all stopped at the 124th meridian, thus cutting off the island, whose name sometimes appeared and sometimes did not. It will be observed that Dr. Campbell in this paper was the means of introducing the erroneous and obnoxious Germanized spelling of Bering's name into English literature. This is a pretty good indication that he had no autographic documents from Bering himself, and that his manuscripts were obtained from German sources, or at least had been transcribed into the German language. In his thorough search of the literature of the subject and lengthy discussion of the results, Dr. Campbell undoubtedly gathered the fullest account of the first expedition which had up to that date been printed. In order to enliven his history of the proceedings, the good doctor occasionally rises to flights of fancy, and the theories he held were long since proved erroneous. There are several other English translations of Du Halde's China, of which the following is the most important. A description of the Empire of China and Chinese Tartary, together with the kingdoms of Korea and Tibet, containing the geography and history, natural as well as civil, of those countries, from the French of P. J. B. Du Halde, Jesuit, illustrated with general and particular maps, and adorned with a great number of cuts, with notes geographical, historical, and critical, and other improvements, particularly in the maps by the translator." London, Edward Cave, 1741, 2 volumes, folio, maps and ills. This edition does not show the name of the translator, but he was evidently a man of no small attainments as a geographer and cartographer, and introduced numerous improvements and corrections into the chart of D'Anville, which accompanied the original edition of Du Halde. A copy of this was presented to the library of Harvard College by the province of New Hampshire in 1765-66, for an opportunity of examining which I am indebted to the courtesy of Mr. Justin Winsor, the librarian. The text of this edition, compared with that of 1736, is as much as possible abridged, yet contains nothing not in the original, but the map exhibits certain additions to be noted. This map is entitled, "A map of Captain Bering's travels from Tobolskoy to Kamchatka between the years 1725 and 1730, with improvements by the editor." It contains the following note by the editor: "Captain Berings probably observed the latitude in the principal places through which he passed, though 2 observations only are mentioned in his journal. But Mr. Kirillov in his map of the Russian Empire does not follow the author in this respect. For instance, he places Ilimski 1° 30' more north, Yakutskoy 2° more south, and Cape Chukotskago 1° more south than Captain Bering's. Likewise other places in proportion. I have reckoned the longitude of Tobolskoy from Paris according to an eclipse of the sun observed at Hamburg and Tobolskoy, mentioned by Mr. Strahlenberg in his account of the northern parts of Europe and Asia. This is all that can be done till the return of the Russian mathematicians sent to make observations and discoveries throughout Siberia." Then follows a line, "inscribed to Francis Gashray, Esquire." The main body of the chart is that of Du Halde's original and the scale is the same, but the height of the neat lines is only 8 5/8 inches. Bering struck from Okhotsk to Bolsheretsk, across Kamchatka northward to 67° 18'. Also he struck eastward from Kamchatka in 1729 and around the peninsula to Bolsheretsk and Okhotsk are indicated by dotted lines. The 2 latitudes noted in Bering's journal are indicated on this map by a plus, and the northern one is placed near the Asiatic coast in latitude 118° east from Tobolsk. At the top of the map the supposed Paris meridians are indicated, a difference between Paris and Tobolsk being assumed of 70°, which is about 5° too much. There are also sundry infelicities in the transliteration of the names from the French of Danville. A chart which deserves notice, though almost wholly fictitious, being chiefly devoted to spurious discoveries of the alleged Admiral de Fonte, was issued by J. N. de Lisle with the concurrence of M. P. Buache, or at his suggestion. It appeared at Paris in 1752 and was copied for Jefferys' second edition of Voyages from Asia to America in 1764. I do not know if this copy appeared in the first edition, but presume it did. For present purposes the interesting features of this map are as follows. Opposite the eastern extreme of the Chukchi Peninsula there is represented part of America with the legend Terre vouée par Monsieur Spanberg en 1528, fréquentée à présent par les Russes, qui en apportent de très belles fureurs. In the English edition the legend is Seen by Spanberg 1728. 4 islands are represented in the strait between Asia and America, corresponding in a general way to the 4 now known to exist there. Connected with America and north of the Chukchi Peninsula is land, with an island off it corresponding not badly to Wrangel and Herald Islands, and marked discovered in 1722. It is possible that this land is a hypothetical compound of the land reported by the Chukchis east of the strait, with that which they knew to be visible in clear weather from Cape Yakan, more or less confused accounts of which had long been current among persons interested in these regions. The next chart of note in this connection was published by Danville, the royal geographer of France, who had previously prepared the original map of Bering for publication. He issued a general map of Asia in 3 parts, each of 2 leaves, which could be joined together, of which the first part appeared in 1751 and the third part in 1753, entitled Troisième partie de la carte d'Asie, contenant la Sibérie et quelques autres parties de la Tartarie, publié sous les auspices de Monseigneur Louis-Philippe d'Orléans, Duc d'Orléans, premier prince de sang, par les seigneurs d'Anville, secrétaire de son Altesse Sérénissime, 1753, avec privilège. This map is in 2 sheets, each 20 by 21 inches, the engraving of the geographical part by Guillaume de la Haye and of the ornamental title by Delafosse. The longitude is reckoned from Ferro, and the map is constructed on a scale of 23 French leagues to 60 geographical miles. The boundaries are colored and the sea shore shaded with short horizontal lines. It is on the polyconic projection. This map includes many of the additions to geography in eastern Siberia, which were due to the members of the Great Siberian Expedition. The courses and branches of the rivers especially were augmented and corrected as well as named. The branches of the Anadyr River were represented and named, but as no new information in regard to the coast had been received at that date, this river was still mapped as entering the sea to the south and west of Cape Thaddeus, as erroneously laid down by Bering, who confounded with the Anadyr a small river which does come in here, and passed the estuary of the true Anadyr without seeing it. The coast lines are essentially those of Bering. Beyond the basins of the Kolyma and Anadyr is marked Terre Inconnue, a small supplement in the northeast corner of the map. On half the scale of the map represents the northeast extreme of Asia as delineated by Bering. This little supplement is of considerable interest, as it gives fuller information than that which appears on the original publication of Du Halde, perhaps from a more modern version of Bering's chart, as previously suggested. Several names appear for the first time in cartographic history upon this map. Preobrazhenia Bay, Bolshoia River falling into Holy Cross Bay, and the Île de Saint Diomede are among these. The island of St. Demetrius is omitted, as well as its name. The island of St. Diomede is placed about on a line between East Cape and Cape Chukotsky, to the westward of the meridian of East Cape. There is a discrepancy averaging about 5 minutes in latitude and longitude between the positions on this map and those on the second version of the Bering manuscript charts. But in the main these differences are, I suspect, merely due to carelessness in copying, and the general harmony between the two leads to the belief that the D'Anville outline for this region was based on the second version of the manuscript. The differences of position for points on this part of the coast are numerous. I have noted them in the comparative table of positions herewith. They may be chiefly owing to slips in transferring from the Mercator to the polyconic projection, but some of them are due to new information probably derived from the surveyors of the second expedition. Bering Island appears on the map in about its proper place, though Copper Island is not indicated, nor are any of the Aleutians shown. I suspect this is the first publication of a cartographic kind on which Bering Island is laid down, as the map of the Imperial Academy of Sciences, embodying the geological results of Bering's voyage to the coast of America, was not engraved until a year later, while de L'Isle's of 1752 does not contain them. The island between Cape Shelaginski and East Cape off the northern coast, on Bering's map, is omitted by D'Anville. The Kamchatkan Peninsula, in latitude 56°, is represented to have a width of 180 miles, while Bering made it 270 miles. A most important contribution to the subject appeared in Müller's historical collections known as the Sammlung Russische Geschichte, and published at St. Petersburg. Des Dritten Bandes contains the original account of the Russian voyages toward America, from which the work of Jefferies has, with some errors and omissions, been translated. As far as regards Bering's first voyage, there is only one error of consequence made by Jefferies, which will be noted in its place. This book is extremely rare, and the only copy in America which I have been able to find after much inquiry is in the library of the Smithsonian Institution. The first volume of this series has the title, Eröffnung eines Vorschlages zur Verbesserung der russischen Historie durch den Druck eines stückweise herauszugebenden Sammlungen von allerlei zu den Umständen und Begebenheiten dieses Reichs gehörigen Nachrichten. St. Petersburg, Beider Kaiserl, Akademie der Wissenschaften, 1732. End quote. The succeeding volumes have the running title Sammlung Russische Geschichte, with the number of the parts subjoined, but no other title page. The account of the Russian voyages is stated by Müller to have been prepared at the direction of the Empress and endorsed by the Academy of Sciences. It contains invaluable material on the early explorations, which, if it had not been for Müller's painstaking researches, would have been totally lost, as the archives of Yakutsk, from whence the data were derived by Müller, were subsequently destroyed by fire. The errors which occur in it are chiefly due to Müller's endeavor to utilize the inexact geographical data of the Promyschleniks and Cossacks by combining them with the less detailed but more precise observations of later observers. In this attempt he added many valuable details to the charts, but at the same time introduced several errors. The exaggerated distances reported by the first explorers, who were unable to correct their estimates by observations of precision, distort those parts of the map due to their reports. The peninsula of Alaska becomes hugely exaggerated, as does the Shelagskoye promontory on the Arctic Sea. But no unprejudiced person can read Müller's account without perceiving his great caution in accepting unreservedly these imperfect contributions. The really important additions which he made to cartography, the preciousness of the facts which he rescued from oblivion, and his desire to be fair to everybody. The insinuations of malice and of a desire to injure Bering by means of this account given by Müller, which Lauridsen attributes to the latter, appear to be entirely the product of a suspicious temperament and an excited imagination. Certainly I have seen nothing anywhere cited which lends to such suspicions any tint of probability. The facts cited in support of them can easily be otherwise explained, if one desires to view the subject judicially, and for the most part are not quite thoroughly understood by the Danish author. One error upon which the latter lays great stress is due to a manipulation of the record, originated or at least adopted by Bering himself, and which is incorporated in the map and report which all authors agree proceeded directly from Bering's own hand. The next map of importance was issued by the Imperial Academy of Sciences, St. Petersburg, in 1754. It was made under the inspection of Gerhard Friedrich Staatsrath von Müller, who revised and corrected it subsequently, when an edition dated 1758 was issued. This map comprised the geographical results of the great Siberian expedition sent out by the Russian government, of Bering's voyages, and of the records of the hunters, Promyschleniks, and traders in northeastern Siberia, preserved in the archives of Yakutsk. The sources of this map are fully explained by Müller in the Russian discoveries. I have not been able to examine a copy of the original map, and have therefore relied on the English version of it, which is to be found in Jefferies' translation, 2nd edition, London, 1764. Among the improvements introduced on this map may be specified the correction of the shores of the Okhotsk Sea and Gulf of Penjina, the correcter location of the mouth of the Anadyr River and its estuary, the introduction of the results of the voyages of Gvozdev, Bering, and Chirikov to the northwest coast of America, and a multitude of details relating to northeastern Siberia. The island of St. Diomede is not represented, though its name appears on the 65th parallel in Bering Strait. The island may have been on the original map and carelessly omitted by Jefferies' engraver on his copy. Among the errors or rather mistaken hypotheses of others which are suggested in this map by dotted lines are the extension westward to 174 degrees east of Greenwich of the peninsula of Alaska, which is also given a wholly uncalled for width, and the northward extension of the coast on each side of Bering Strait. In the former case the cartographer was misled by the errors of the map of Bering and Chirikov's last voyage and rumours reported by other navigators, and in the second case he followed Bering in adopting an erroneous position and exaggerated form for the coast eastward from Koliuchin Bay. due to the uncorrected sketches of the Cossacks and traders. The northern extension of the American coast opposite was purely hypothetical, and for this Müller must be held responsible. Many of the western allusions are exaggerated in size and erroneous in position, but the chart of Bering's last voyage and the exaggerated reports of the hunters who followed him must be held responsible for this in the main. The work in which this chart appears is largely derived from Müller's Sammlung Russische Geschichte, St. Petersburg, 1758, Volume 3, Parts 1 to 3. The first edition is entitled, according to bibliographers, Voyages from Asia to America for completing the discoveries of the northwest coast of America. A summary of voyages made by the Russians on the Frozen Sea, from the High Dutch of S. Müller, by T. Jefferies. London, T. Jefferies, 1761. 66, 76 pages, quarto, with 4 maps. The second edition, which is that referred to in this paper, is entitled Voyages from Asia to America for completing the discoveries of the northwest coast of America, to which is prefixed a summary of the voyages made by the Russians on the Frozen Sea in search of a northeast passage, serving as an explanation of a map of the Russian discoveries published by the Academy of Sciences at Petersburg. London, T. Jefferies, 1764. 8, 120 pages, quarto, 4 maps. A French translation by Dumas, with the author's initials misprinted GP instead of GF, was printed at Amsterdam in 1766. It consisted of 2 volumes, 18, with a map. A Danish translation by Morten Hallager was issued at Copenhagen in 1784 as a portion of a volume relating to northern explorations. Bibliographers seem to have been puzzled by the discrepancy of initials, not recognizing that the S in Jefferies' volume stood for a title and not a name. Another work important in its collection of facts bearing upon the general question of the explorations eastward by the Russians was published by the Archdeacon of Wilts, Rev. William Cox, in 1780. This was followed by a second edition during the same year. A third edition, accompanied by a supplement of 57 pages, was printed in 1787, and a fourth in 1803. There were 2 apparently distinct translations of the book printed at Paris in 1781, and a German edition at Frankfurt and Leipzig in 1783. The third edition, which is the best and most correct, appeared both in octavo and quarto form, and is that to which reference is made in this paper. It is entitled, Account of the Russian discoveries between Asia and America, to which are added the conquest of Siberia and the history of transactions and commerce between Russia and China. London, T. Cadell, 1787. 410 pages, octavo or quarto, with 4 charts and 1 plate, to which is added, consecutively paged, a comparative view of the Russian discoveries with those made by Captains Cook and Clark, and a sketch of what remains to be ascertained by future navigators. London, T. Cadell, 1787. Pages 417 to 456, octavo. The latter was also separately issued. Among the maps contained in this work of Cox are a reduced copy of the general map of Russia issued by the Imperial Academy of Sciences, St. Petersburg, 1776, and a chart of Synd's voyage toward Chukotsky Nos. The latter is the only chart of Synd's voyage, 1764 to 1768, which is accessible, and it is vouched for as authentic by Dr. Cox. Compared with later charts, it is, of course, extremely imperfect, yet there is in it enough resemblance to the truth to enable us to recognize what was intended in many instances. In the northeastern part of the chart the latitudes are exaggerated and the longitudes contracted in a very erroneous manner. Nevertheless, we recognize East Cape, here named Prom Chukotskoy, the 2 islands now called the Diomedes, but here left nameless, A large island moved eastward out of place, but doubtless intended for Arakam Island, is called I. Diomedes, while along a crowd of islets referable to the hills of St. Lawrence Island, seen through a fog and laid down very inaccurately, the name S. Diomedes appears again. The American coast was seen and landed upon. Cape Prince of Wales and the shores south and east from it are recognizable. The island of St. Matthew was discovered and named, though placed a degree too far south. The island of St. Paul in the Pribilof group was discovered by Synd, put in its true latitude and named Preobrazhenia or Transfiguration Island. It is about 7 degrees out in relative longitude and 14 in absolute longitude. One cannot doubt, however, that it was the island now known as St. Paul when we recall the fact that there are no other islands than the Pribilof group in that latitude or within that general area of Bering Sea. The southern cape of the Chukchi Peninsula, Chukotsky Cape of Bering and Müller, is represented 2 degrees too far south. Preobrazhenia Bay is not recognizable, but the name is transferred to the bight western north of Cape Bering of our present charts. This part of the coast was not however approached by Synd, who spent much time on the coast of Kamchatka. On his chart this peninsula is represented better than we should have expected from the rudeness of the rest. The map of the Academy shows the influence of those who discredited the near approach of America to eastern Siberia. Notwithstanding the exploration of Deshnev, Gvozdev, and Synd, the American shore of Bering Strait has disappeared altogether. The eastern portion of the Chukchi Peninsula is intended by a host of hypothetical inlets and defended by an unrecognizable archipelago of nameless islands. The far-stretching chain of islands among which Bering's second expedition was so long entangled, excepting those confirmed by Krenigen and Levashev, who sailed far north of the southern arc of the chain, is also absent. Excepting that the fictitious peninsula north from Chukchi Land is effaced, the map in its main features for this region is less accurate than that of Bering, and does not compare very favorably with that of Müller. And yet, but shortly after its publication, the explorations of Cook and Clark recorded the facts which should, when published, exalt the memory of the older geographers and scatter the hypotheses which for a time prevailed against them. Their explorations are included in a voyage to the Pacific Ocean undertaken by the command of His Majesty for making discoveries in the Northern Hemisphere, performed under the direction of Captains Cook, Clark, and Gore in His Majesty's ships the Resolution and Discovery in the years 1776 to 1780. London, for T. Nicol and T. Cadell, 1784 5. 3 volumes, 4º, and Atlas Folio. This is the edition ordered by the Admiralty. Of this celebrated work, said to have been written from the explorers' manuscripts by Bishop Douglas, there have been many editions. In the Bulletin of the Société de Géographie, Paris, 1879, pages 481 to 540, is a bibliography by James Jackson. The most interesting points in regard to Cook's explorations about Bering Strait are comprised on the chart entitled Chart of Norton Sound and of Bering Strait made by the East Cape of Asia and the West Point of America. On this chart the main features of the coast on either side of the strait are correctly indicated, though several of the inlets and bays are wanting. The Diomedes and Fairway Rock of modern charts are located but left without names. King's Island is named. Arakam was not recognized as an island, nor was Point Chaplin, Indian Point, observed. St. Lawrence Island was seen in foggy weather. Its isolated hills, connected by very low flat land, led Cook into the error of supposing that it comprised several islands, one of which he correctly referred to that named St. Lawrence by Bering, and the rest he lumped under the name of Clark's Islands. A single fictitious island midway between St. Lawrence and King's appears on the chart, but is not named or mentioned in the text. St. Lawrence Bay is named and discovered. Bering and Müller's Chukotsky Cape is correctly identified. East Cape is well delineated, and the name Sertse Kamen hard rock, originally given to a cliff or bluff point at the entrance of Holy Cross Bay, is transferred to a point on the Arctic shore of the peninsula. There is a confused and somewhat curious history connected with the use of the names Serce Kamen and Chukotsky Cape. After the travels of Deshnev, Popov, and others, and the reception at various times of information from the natives, it was pretty generally understood among the hunters and traders of this region that the extreme of Asia was a cape or point on or near which the Chukchi dwelt, or which they described, which was not definitely located, and which was vaguely known as the Chukchi Cape or the Cape of the Chukchis. Chukotsky Nos in the Russian tongue. Cape Serce Kamen will be found on the chart of Bering's voyage. It was the point where the Chukchis successfully defended themselves against the invading Russians who sought to force them to pay tribute. Beyond it, for the Russians all was mysterious Chukchi country with an unknown coast. This cape being their ne plus ultra, it is probable that it was more or less confounded by these illiterate and ignorant hunters with the supposed eastern cape of Asia, otherwise the Cape of the Chukchis as used by Müller. Admit this, and it is not difficult to frame an hypothesis which shall account for the confusion without recourse to the absurd charges with which Lauridsen attempts to soil the reputation of Müller, Steller, and others. When Bering named a cape near which he met a bridal load of Chukchi, who gave him some geographical information, among other things that the coast made a turn after passing it, he called this cape with great propriety the Cape of the Chukchis, as observed by Cook, and with no reference to the legendary Cape of the Chukchis above referred to. But when Müller and others more familiar with the records of the earlier explorers came to make maps, they naturally applied the legendary name to the cape, which they supposed to be the eastern end of Asia, and beyond which the coast makes a turn to the west. Müller, believing in a great cape or peninsula on the northern coast of the Chukchi country, supposed this to be the true Cape Chukotsky, and to the eastern cape of Bering he left the name of Serce Kamen, probably knowing little about the original Cape Serce. And as Bering, by the ambiguity of his journal, gave color to the idea that he had rounded East Cape and pursued the north coast west of it for a few hours before turning homeward, what more natural than that those little acquainted with the region should speak of his turning back from near Serce Kamen? Thus Cook, following out the same idea derived from his study of the map and journal in Harris, transferred the name to a point in the latitude at which Bering turned back on the coast which he supposed him to have surveyed. There is plenty of confusion here, but no just ground for supposing malice in it. A publication which throws much light upon Bering's voyage of 1728 was printed by Vasily Nikolaevich Berg, a well-known writer on geographical matters in connection with Russian history. It is in the Russian language and the title may be translated as follows: First Sea Voyages of the Russians undertaken for the settlement of this geographical problem. Are Asia and America united? And performed in 1727, 28, and 29 under the command of fleet captain of the first rank Vitus Bering, to which is added a short biographical account of Captain Bering and some of his officers. St. Petersburg, Academical Printing Office, 1823, octavo, 126 pages, 1 map, Russian text. This book was printed, as many private books are, at the printing office of the Imperial Academy of Sciences, but was not published or printed by the Academy. The only copies I know of are those in the library of the Academy and one in the British Museum Library, neither of which I have been able personally to consult, but through the kind offices of Dr. S. Hazenstein of the Zoological Museum of the Academy, I learned that Berg found in the archives of the State Admiralty Department the logbook of Midshipman Peter Chaplin, entitled Midshipman Peter Chaplin's Journal of the Kamchatka Expedition of 1725 to 1731. From this MSS and from the notes of G.F. Müller and Admiral Nagayev, Berg compiled his work. Chaplin's journal is not reprinted verbatim, but only paraphrased by Berg, who adds his own commentary on the subject matter, and occasionally gives extracts from Chaplin, whose logbook seems to have been kept in a model way. An effort will be made to obtain a copy of the original logbook. but for the present we are obliged to be content with what of authenticity remains to the data which have been translated or paraphrased by Berg, Lauridsen, and Olson, necessarily submitting to more or less modification in the process. The most authentic and important document for the history of this voyage is naturally the official report handed in by Bering himself and printed in the Journal of the Military Topographical Depot of the Russian Army, Volume 10, pages 67 to 79, St. Petersburg, 1847. This journal is a quarto, and the report is printed verbatim et literatim, if one may judge by the archaic and misspelled words with which it is adorned. It comprises Bering's report including his instructions, a table of geographical positions, and a painfully detailed table of routes and distances by which his position in Kamchatka was computed. This report has never been translated in full and unmodified. The original is thought to have been lost. The present publication is not referred to by Lauridsen and was apparently unknown to him. I have therefore thought it worth while to prepare an English version of the report and geographical table, which are incorporated in this paper. The result shows that the previous versions of the report which have appeared were more or less mutilated or colored by the editors printing them, probably with the view of making the report of more popular interest to their readers, but with injurious results to its historic value for reference. We now come to the latest contributions to the subject. If it were not for the deficiencies in them, which seem to me serious, this paper would not have been prepared, but it seems to be a pity that the sources of information in regard to Bering, accessible to those who do not read Russian, should not be both more impartial and more accurate. Vitus J. Bering och de russiske opdagelsesreiser fra 1725 to 43 F. P. Lauridsen, utgivet med understøttelse af dem Hilmstene Rosenkroniske Stiftelse, København, Kildendalske Bokhandelsforlag, Hegel und Søn, of Bagges Bogtrykkeri, 1885. Small quarto, 211 pages, 4 sheets of charts, 1 plate, 1 woodcut. This work is an attempt at a life of Bering, which should combine an account of his career with a reversal of the generally received opinion in regard to his indecision of character. It embodies a general polemic against those who at different times have criticized the explorer. It contains a paraphrase of some portions of Berg's work which had not previously been accessible in any language except the Russian, yet which would have been much more valuable in the shape of exact translation and quotation. The author labored under the disadvantages of not understanding the language in which all the original records, both printed and in manuscript, are written, of having little or no familiarity with nautical surveying or cartography, and of being apparently unacquainted with the best modern charts of the region. His criticisms of others are couched in very heated and not altogether parliamentary language, and he is the victim of a narrow spirit of nationalism which is sometimes mistaken for patriotism. Nevertheless, he has brought together a great deal of information. It is evident, in spite of his violent criticisms, that he has not intended to be unfair, since he puts on record in several instances evidence damaging to his own views which would not otherwise have come to light. And he has certainly exhibited Bering's valuable qualities in a manner which will do much towards rehabilitating his reputation. Footnote: I may take opportunity in this place of replying to certain criticisms of Mr. Lauridsen on the chronological chapter of my work on Alaska and its resources published in 1870. That chapter was and was stated in its introductory paragraph to be a compilation from the authorities on the subject. It contained no original matter except that relating to explorations subsequent to 1865. For Bering's 2 voyages I consulted the report on the Russian discoveries, printed by order of the Empress and under the auspices of the Imperial Academy of Sciences at St. Petersburg, prepared by the distinguished geographer Müller, himself a member of the second expedition and personally acquainted with the actors in those scenes. No more authoritative printed document exists on the subject. The supposed errors animadverted upon by Mr. Lauridsen are either taken directly from Müller or are inferences drawn from his report. Some of them the critic has misunderstood or misconstrued, which from the necessary extreme condensation of my table is particularly easy. The expression of surprise that Bering passed through Bering Strait without seeing the Diomedes was warranted by the fact that Bering nowhere mentions their name or speaks of seeing any islands in their location, nor are they on his earlier printed charts. This point, however, will be more fully dealt with later. If I were to rewrite that chapter, I should probably modify the criticisms of Bering's character which appear in it. But at the time it was written I was fresh from 4 years' exploration in the same region, and was particularly impressed with his failure to secure better results when to do so would have been so easy, as well as directly in the line of his duty. Review Bulletin of the American Geographical Society for 1885. New York, The Society, 1885, pages 285 to 298. This review forms part of a reply to criticisms upon the voyage of the Vega around Asia and Europe by Baron A. E. von Nordenskjöld, translated from the Swedish by Vir A. Elvwing. It is addressed only toward certain points in Lauridsen's work, and contains valuable corrections of certain errors therein, and information in regard to the work of Strahlenberg and the other early cartographers of eastern Siberia. It is a translation of a paper published in Ymer for 1885, to which for exact accuracy reference should be made. Russian Explorations, 1725 to 1743. Vitus Bering, the discoverer of Bering Strait, by Peter Lauridsen, revised by the author and translated from the Danish by Julius E. Olson. Chicago, S. C. Griggs & Company, 1889, octavo, 14, 223 pages, 2 cuts, 2 folding sheets of maps. This edition is a good deal condensed, especially in the matter of references, and does not have all the illustrations of the original. There are also a good many slips of typographical errors which affect its value as a work of reference. Some of those important in connection with the present paper are as follows. Page 31, line 4. 60 degrees 50 minutes north latitude should be 62 degrees 50 minutes. On the last line of the same page, longitude should be latitude. Page 32. After cloudy weather, in the second line from the bottom, the whole remaining record of August 15th is omitted altogether. The sentence beginning from noon relates to August 16th, nautical reckoning. Page 33, line 5. 30 degrees 19 minutes east should be 30 degrees 17 minutes east. Line 20 after half west should be inserted south by east by compass. Page 51, line 4 from bottom, latitude should be longitude. Review Nation, New York, volume 49, number 1275, pages 454, December the 5th, 1889. I may add that a number of references to Russian articles treating of Bering will be found in my bibliography of charts and publications relating to Alaska and adjacent region, published by the U.S. Coast Survey in 1879. End of section 12.